In this tutorial, I will show you how to bake multiple materials and multiple objects to the same texture maps in Blender, and that way they can share the same material. And this method will work for multiple objects which are sharing the same material, and it will work for multiple objects which have different materials. And this method will also work for a single object which is using multiple materials. If you'd like to learn the basics of texture baking in Blender, then definitely check out my texture baking for beginners tutorial with the link in the description. And you can also check out my texture baking tutorial playlist to learn more about texture baking in Blender. So in this example here, I have this Battle Axe 3D model that I created. And this Battle Axe is made out of 3 different objects. So it has the blade object, it also has this metal part here, and then it also has this wooden pole. And there are 2 different materials. So I created this procedural wood material on the handle, and then I also created this procedural metal material. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to bake both of these materials to the same texture maps, and then they can share the same material. And if you'd like to use the same project files that I'm using and follow along with this tutorial, then I will have a free download of the project files on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page with the links in the description. Or you can just use whatever model you're trying to bake. And if you're downloading the project files on my Gumroad store, you can throw a few dollars into the price box before purchasing to send me a little tip and help support this channel if you'd like to. Or you can just punch in 0 and download the project files for free. So the first thing that we need to do is add an image to bake to. So you can just select whichever material you want. I'm going to select the wooden pole object. So I'm in the shading tab, so I have the 3D viewport over here and the shader nodes over here. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for the image texture, and let's drop the image texture here above the principled shader. Now we need to create an image to bake to, so let's click on the new button to create a new image. And then on the name here, I can just call this X. Now the width and height is going to determine the resolution of the image, and I want my texture maps to be very high quality, so I'm going to change this to a 4K texture. So I'm going to click and then drag down and then let go, and this way we can change both values at the same time. And I'm going to type in 4096 and then hit enter, and this is the standard resolution for a 4K texture. So just change this to whatever resolution you want for the image textures, and then you can leave all the other settings at the default and click on OK. So this image is the image that we are going to bake the textures onto. The next thing that we need to do is UV unwrap all the objects to this image. So what I'm going to do is click right up here to go to the UV editing workspace. And then I'm going to press the tab key to go back to object mode. And then what I need to do is just select all the objects. So if you only have a single object with multiple materials, you can just select that single object. In this case, I have 3 objects. So I'm going to hold down the Shift key and select all 3 objects at once. Then I'm going to press the tab key, and this will go into multi-object editing. So you can see we're in edit mode of all 3 objects. And then right over here on the side, we have the UV editor. So I'm going to scroll right over here, and then I want to click on the drop down, and I want to preview the image that we created. And this is the image that we're going to bake to. So we now need to UV unwrap the objects onto the image. And if you'd like to learn the basics of UV unwrapping in Blender, then definitely check out my UV unwrapping for beginners tutorial. I'll have the link in the description. But for this object, I'm just going to use the Smart UV project. So press the A key to make sure all the mesh is selected in edit mode, and then I'm going to press the U button, and for this I'm just going to use the Smart UV project, and then I do want a little bit of space in between the islands to make sure there isn't any overlapping, so I'm going to turn the island margin to a 0.003, and then I will click on OK. So with the Smart UV project, Blender's going to do the best job that it can to UV unwrap the mesh onto the image. Now the materials that I have on this axe are procedural, so they're not using UV mapping, but if you're using materials which have texture maps, then you may already be using the UV mapping of the object. And so in that case, if you re-UV unwrap the object, it might mess up the placement of the textures. So in that case, then you should check out my other video on how to texture bake objects from one UV map to another UV map in Blender. And in that video, I basically show you how to create 2 different UV maps, and then I show you how to bake textures from the first UV map to the new UV map. I'm not going to cover that in this video, but you can definitely check that out with the link in the description. Now this UV map actually isn't very optimized. There's a lot of pixel space right here that we're not actually using, and so when we bake the textures, it's not actually going to look that high quality because there are so many pixels here that we're not using in the image. So what I want to do is make the UV islands as big as I can, and that way we'll be able to use more of the pixels in the image. So what you can do is hover your mouse over the islands and press the L key, and that is going to select the entire entire island. And I'm going to continue to do that, so press the L key with your mouse hovered over the islands, and that's going to select multiple islands. And then in the UV editing, you can press S to scale, you can press R to rotate, and G to grab, just like in the 3D viewport. And so I'm going to scale up these islands, and I'm going to make them as large as possible. And so the bigger they are, the more pixels it's going to use in the texture map, and the higher quality the bake will look. So I'm going to continue to do this just by selecting some islands, and I'm going to scale them up, and I'm going to optimize this better. Alright, so I've gone ahead and optimized the UV islands, so you can see the UV islands are much bigger now, and so they're going to be able to use more of the pixels in the image. Now, one really important thing is to make sure there isn't any overlapping of the UVs, because if there's overlapping, then it will mess up the texture baking. So to make sure there's no overlapping, you can press the A key to deselect everything, and then you can click on select, and you can click on select overlap, and you can see nothing was selected. And then also make sure that all of the islands are within the boundary of the image. They need to be within the boundary of the image, and you can see these are all inside the image. Alright, so we're now going to go back over to the shading tab. And the next thing that we need to do is we need to add this image to all of the different materials. So what I'm going to do is select this wood material, and then I'm going to click on this axe image. I'm now going to press Ctrl C to copy the image, and then I'm going to click right over here on this metal material, and I'm going to press Ctrl V to paste the image. And so you just need to select each material and add the same image to all the materials. And if you have a single object which has multiple materials applied to it, then you can go right over here to the material properties, and right up here in the texture slots, you can select all the different materials and then add the same image. Alright, so we can now go over the bake settings. So if you click right up here on the render properties, right here on the render engine, you need to be using cycles render because Eevee doesn't support baking. Now, if your scene is using Blender Eevee, that's totally fine. You can just switch it to cycles, then you can do the baking, and then you can switch it back to Eevee once you're done with the baking. So make sure to set to cycles. And then let's also open up the sampling tab right here, and right here on the render samples, I want to turn the samples all the way down to 1, because if you turn the samples down, then it will bake faster, but it won't affect the quality of the bake if you turn the samples down. So I can now close the sampling tab, and I can now open up the bake tab. And again, make sure you're using cycles render, because in Eevee, this baking tab won't show up. So I'm going to be baking 4 different texture maps. I'm going to be baking a base color, a metallic, a roughness, and a normal. But you can just bake whatever texture maps you need for your object. And again, definitely check out my texture baking tutorial playlist to learn how to bake all of the different maps. So the first one that I'm going to bake is the color map. So right here on the bake settings, you want to change this to diffuse, because diffuse is the same as color. And then if you open up the influence right here, we want to turn off the direct and indirect, because the direct and indirect is actually going to bake the lighting data. So it's actually going to bake the lighting which is on the object. But I don't want to do that. I just want to bake the color. So just turn off the direct and indirect. And then also what's really important before you bake the color maps is you need to make sure to turn off any metallic values. So if your object isn't made out of metal, then you can just ignore this part. But with my object, I am using one material which is metallic. So what you need to do is select any of the materials which are metal, and right here on the metallic value, you need to make sure it is turned to 0. Or if you have any textures being plugged into the metallic value, you need to unplug it from the metallic value and then turn the metallic value to 0. Then we can bake the color map, and then once we're done, we can turn the metallic value back to 1. For some reason, if you have the metallic value turned to 1 and you bake the color map, the image will look very dark. So make sure all of the metallic values are turned to 0 before you bake the color map. Now, I also want to be able to preview the image as it's baking. So what I'm going to do is click right here when the crosshair appears in the corner, and I'm going to drag down, and that's going to split the window. And then if you click right here to change the editor type, I'm going to change this to the image editor. And then if you click right here on the drop down, I'm going to select the axe image. And this way I can see the material once it's finished baking. Now, what's really important before you hit the bake button is you need to make sure you have all the objects selected that you want to bake. So in this case, I have 3 different objects, so I'm going to hold down the shift key and select all 3 objects. Or if you just have one object, you can just select the single object. And then what's also really important before you actually bake this is you need to select the image within all the materials. So right here, this axe image, you need to click on it and make sure it's selected, and you know it's selected if it has that white outline. So I'm going to hold down the shift key, and I'm also going to select the wood object, and then I can preview the wood material and make sure that is selected. And again, if you have an object which has multiple materials applied to it, then right up here on the material properties, you can select each material and then make sure that that image is selected. So then you can go right back up here to the render properties, and then we have the bake type set to diffuse, and I can click on the bake button. And you can see there's a loading bar right down here, and it's going to go through and bake each object. So it's already done the first one, and now it's doing the second one, and now that's finished, and now it is doing the last one. So there we go, it has baked all 3 of the objects. So right here in the image editor, this is the color map. And if I click right here to go back to the UV editing layout, I can click right here and make sure that I have this image selected, and you can see that the UV editing is matching up with the image. So I can go right back over here to the shading workspace, and then I want to save this image to a file on my computer, so I can click on image, and then I can click on save as. And then I'm going to rename this image to axe color because this is the color map, and I'll just save it as a PNG file, and then I will click on save as. So that is the color map. So we now need to do the other 3 maps. Now, because I'm finished baking the color maps, I can select the metal materials, and right here on the metallic values, I can turn these back to 1, or if you have some sort of texture going into the metallic value, you can plug that back up because we're done baking the color maps. So the next map that we're going to bake is the roughness map. So right over here on the bake settings, right here on the bake type, we want to change this to roughness. And then everything else is pretty much already set up. We have the images in the materials, and we also have the object selected. Now, something that's really important before you bake the roughness map is right here on the color space, you need to change this to the non-color data, whereas the color map was set to the sRGB. Now, the color map was set to sRGB because it was contributing to the base color of the material. But any textures which aren't contributing to the color of the material need to be set to non-color here on the color space. So right here on the color space, make sure you set that to non-color for the roughness texture. And then again, hold down the shift key and make sure that you have all the objects selected. And then you also need to go through each material, and you need to make sure that the image texture is selected. And if the image texture is selected, Blender will know to bake to that image. So then press Ctrl S again to save the Blender file. We have the bake type set to roughness, and so I can now click on bake again. And it's going to go through and it's going to bake each material from each object. So we can now save this image. So let's click right up here on image and then click on save as. And then this one, I want to rename it from color to roughness. So axe roughness. And again, I'll just save this as a PNG file and click on save as. All right, so we can now bake the normal map. So right here on the bake type, we want to click on this and we want to change it to the normal. So just select the normal. And then again, the normal map isn't contributing to the base color. So here on the color space, we want to set this to non-color. So then again, make sure that you have all the objects selected that you want to bake, and within each material, make sure that the image is selected. And then you can click on the bake button and bake the normal map. And here is the normal map, and the baking is finished. So I can now click on image and click on save as. And this image I want to rename to axe normal because it is the normal map. And I'll save this as a PNG file and I'll click on save as. So then the last map that I want to bake is the metallic map because one of these materials is a metal material. But if none of your objects are metal, then you don't need to bake this map. And I actually have a separate tutorial on how to bake the metallic map, so if you'd like to check that out, I'll have the link in the description. Now for the metallic map, if you go here to the bake type and click on this to change it, you can see there isn't actually any metallic value. So because there's no metallic value to bake to, I'm going to use the emission instead. So you can click on emit here. Emit is short for emission. And then to bake the emission values, I'm going to be using the Node Wrangler add-on. So if you don't have the add-on enabled, you can click on edit and you can go to the preferences. And then over there on the add-ons tab, just search for Node Wrangler and just checkmark the Node Wrangler add-on. So now that the Node Wrangler add-on is enabled, I can Control, Shift, and select different nodes, and that is going to plug the node directly up to the surface, and it's going to preview that node on the object. And so what you can do is select the material, which is metal, and you can Control Shift and select the metallic value to preview it. And then that way it's going to bake that value. Now in this case, I don't actually have any texture being plugged up to the metallic value because my metallic value is turned all the way up to 1. So what I can do instead is just bake a color value. So I'm going to press Shift A, I'm going to go to the search, and I'm going to search for the RGB node. And I can actually just plug the color up to the metallic, and then I can Control Shift and select the principled shader. So if you turn the color value all the way up to white, it's going to be completely metallic, but if you turn the color all the way to black, it's not going to be metallic at all. So I want to turn this color all the way up to white so that it is completely metallic. And then I can Control Shift and select the RGB node to preview it. So now that it's completely white, it's going to bake as completely white, and then that will tell it to be completely metallic. Now I'm also going to hold down the Shift key and select the wood material, and the wood material is not metallic at all. So for this one, I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for another RGB node, and let's stick this right here. And then I can Control Shift and select the RGB node to preview it. And then on the RGB value, I want to turn this all the way to black because the wood material is not metallic at all. Or you can just Control Shift and select any image texture if you have an image texture going into the metallic. So I now just need to bake the images. So again, hold down the Shift key and make sure you select all the objects, and then also within each material, make sure that you select the image, and that'll tell Blender to bake to that image. So I need to make sure to select this image here, and also on this material, I need to make sure to select this image here. And then right here on the bake type, we have this set to emission, and that way it'll bake whatever we are previewing using the Node Wrangler. And then before you bake this, you also need to make sure that the color space is set to non-color because the metallic map isn't contributing to the base color of the material. So if you set the color space to non-color on this image, it should copy over and set it to non-color for all of the different materials because it's using the same image data. So then we can click on the bake button and bake the image. And the baking is finished. So again, you can click on image and you can click on save as. And then this image I'm going to rename to Axe Metallic because it's the metallic map, and I'll click on save as. Alright, so we've baked all the image textures, so we can now just delete all the materials, and then we can add a new material and add all the image textures. Now just in case there's a problem with the baking and I want to go back to this old material, what I'm going to do is click on this shield button right here, and that is going to add a fake user to the material. And this way, even if I delete the material from all the objects, it's going to keep this material data in the Blender file. So I can go back to it if I want to. So I'm also going to select the wood material, and then I can click on the shield icon to add a fake user. So I can now just delete this material, and I can click on this object here and click on the X button to delete that material, and click on this object here and click on the X button to delete the material. So I can now click on the new button to add a fresh new material, and I'm going to rename this material to Axe Baked Textures. And then I can click and drag, and I can drop this material on all the other objects. So you can add the same material to all of the different objects. So I'm now going to add in the images that we baked. So with the principled texture selected, I'm going to press Ctrl-Shift-T. And when you do that, it'll bring up Blender's file browser, and I can now just select all of the image textures. So I'm going to select the color, and then I'm going to hold down the Shift key and select the roughness and the normal and the metallic. And I can now click on the principled texture setup button. And this is using a feature of the Node Wrangler add-on, and so it's automatically going to set up all the texture maps for us. And then also on the metallic, roughness, and normal, it is set the color space to non-color because these images are not contributing to the base color of the material. And there we have it. So now these three different objects are all using the same material. And again, if you'd like to download the free project files, then you can do that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page with the links in the description. And if you'd like to learn more about texture baking in Blender, then definitely check out my texture baking tutorial playlist with the link in the description. And if you'd like to help support me and this YouTube channel, I will have links in the description to where you can support the channel on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page and the YouTube memberships. And I do appreciate all of your support. But I hope you found this tutorial helpful, and thank you for watching.